I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. On tonight's episode, we're going to take a moment just to savor this victory. We'll talk about the Utah offense versus the Utah defense. We'll go on to 6 bits. We'll talk about that Florida defense rising to the occasion against the Utah offense, and we'll do a Kentucky look ahead for $1. Will, there's only one appropriate way to jump into 2 bits tonight. How about them Gators, baby?
Hey man, that's about as much fun as you're gonna have in the swamp. That place was rocking. Even the Utah fans, when they left, were like, "Wow, you guys do it right." My kid, we sort of started out in a place where there wasn't a whole lot of noise because I wasn't sure how he was going to deal with it. I took him down to experience some of the noise in the third quarter. I was like, "Hey, you want to go back?" And he's like, "No, we're going to stay outside." I'm like, "Yes, I've got him. He's hooked." So, look, I mean, and actually, I asked him, I was like, "Are you going to watch Kentucky with me next week?" And he's like, "Yeah." And I'm like, "Well, okay, well, we'll sit down in front of the TV." He's like, "No, in the stadium." And I'm like, "Oh, I got somebody hooked. I like it." So it was a great weekend all around, but certainly, to win a game against a top 10 opponent to start off the Napier era, couldn't have asked for much more. And if you'd have told me a 3-point win before the game, I would have said, yeah, just about every Gator fan's going to take that. If you'd have said Amari Burney's going to get an interception because he's going to use his instincts to cut off a throw to the tight end deep in the red zone, I think we all would have said, huh, I don't have that one on my bingo card, but there it goes. That's why we play the games. Always get the unexpected stuff, regardless of what all the pundits think going in.
Although good guess about Cam Rising liking to throw to a tight end, Amari Burney. I think he caught on to the pattern throughout the game there. Look, you mentioned it a little bit here, but you brought your boy Max to his first Gator game. He's 7 years old, right? What was that experience like for him overall, man? That's
Well, I
pretty
mean,
cool. First game. That's your first game. Big time environment. Big time win like that. Of course, you're gonna be hooked for life, man.
Well, first tailgate too. So we took him to a tailgate, took him out there around 10 a.m. He was tailgated out by about 1:30 or 2. So headed back to the house, let him take a little bit of a breather. He didn't take a nap, but let him sort of calm down and get in the cool. And then headed to the stadium, got up there, and he's just like every 7-year-old. As long as you give him food, he's happy. So for the first half, it was just, "Dad, can you get me food? Dad, can you get me food?" So I had to come back and rewatch the game to make sure I didn't miss anything for the analysis. But the second half, he was enthralled. He's sitting there just looking at it, going crazy every time. And it was so back and forth, it's like, "Oh, the Gators are behind." No, it's like, "Hey, we're ahead." Yeah. And he's sitting there high-fiving people in the stands and all that sort of stuff. And he's a pretty reserved kid. He's not somebody who sits there and like jumps up and down and goes crazy all the time. So for him to want to go back to the stadium next week, I think says everything you need to know about the experience. And I had sent you some video of him tailgating, and I'm not sure whether he enjoyed the tailgate more or the game more. So it was a good week, good Saturday all around.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome to hear. Yeah, those pictures were great, dude. That looked like he was having a great time. Just the look on his face looked like he had a great time. So overall, absolutely electric environment in the swamp on Saturday. Do we ever want to go back to having going back to the old season openers and playing I don't know, some directional school for a season opener? Do we ever want to do that again, or is this the way to do things from now on?
It's a cool way to do things, and obviously we've got the game out in Utah next year, so it's going to be sort of a fun reciprocation of this. But it's a whole lot easier to have these openers when you've got Anthony Richardson at quarterback, as opposed to breaking in somebody who hasn't had any snaps. And I think that plays a big role. I mean, the reason the game was so good is because Rising and Richardson have both played enough to where you're not guessing about what their skills and abilities are, and it's not Skylar Morhenwig out there in his first career start. It's you've got some clue what you're getting from each of those guys, which is part of what makes it so interesting, and part of what makes it maybe easier to predict than a normal opener is there were a lot of returning guys. So it's a question of where they're going to play up to their potential, and obviously they put on a classic. So look, I mean, I don't like the cupcakes. I don't want the cupcakes. You sit there and you watch Florida play in Utah, and then everybody's like, "Oh, well, look at Miami beating Bethune-Cookman by 70 points." And you're like, "Well, that's great that they scored 70 points. But if you put Florida against Bethune-Cookman, you would have gotten a very similar result." what did you actually show by winning that game? And we all know college football is moving more towards this. I mean, it's the TV dollars are not going to be there for Miami, Bethune-Cookman coming up 4 or 5 years from now, especially as they expand the playoff. But yeah, look, I think anytime you play good non-conference games, it makes a huge difference. But obviously, the SEC season is a pressure cooker, and Florida 3 or 4 weeks from now is going to answer that question, because it's not, was it an electric game against Utah? It's, are you able to survive until your bye week because you've played a bunch of physical games, whereas you get the guys out in the middle of the second quarter if you play, Eastern Washington.
Yeah, look, watching those North Carolina schools up in the ACC on the road at smaller schools in state with UNC at App State, NC State at ECU this weekend. Like, even those games, hey man, okay, you pulled out, you won by the skin of your teeth, and nobody was impressed at the same time. So it's, I don't know. So even those smaller games, not always a guarantee. And I think you can look to Atlanta and Oregon fans and say, hey, experience at quarterback is not necessarily an indicator of success on opening day either, because they had plenty of that going into that game. So I think we just saw two of the better quarterbacks in college football go at it here on Saturday. And it was, and look, hey, Rising did not play a perfect game. We'll get into the details here shortly, but Rising didn't play a perfect game, but when it mattered, he did step up and he did play pretty darn well at times. And hey, both defenses had to hang on for dear life there, Will.
Yeah, both defenses were gassed by the end.
Yeah.
And anybody who was outside, just walking up to the stadium, you got up there and went, oh, these guys are going to be tired by the time the fourth quarter comes around, because it wasn't hot, but it was like you were breathing in the bath. Like it was like you were in the bathroom in terms of what it felt like.
I wasn't there. It did rain for a good part of the afternoon on Saturday, though. But
it didn't come down very hard. So it just sort of sprinkled from probably like 2 or 3 o'clock until game time, and then it stopped right around 7:15, maybe even a little bit before game time. It stopped raining, and then it was clear the rest of the night, but everything was wet. So like they didn't have the band come down on the field to play beforehand because they didn't want to muck it up. They, in fact, it sort of screwed everything up for people who were trying to time things, because the flyover came and it's like, wait, the band hasn't come on the field yet. What's going on? So it was a little bit of it was a different experience than what I've experienced before on beautiful days there in the swamp. But yeah, so everything was wet. They had to go out, but in all the TV timeouts, you probably didn't see it at any point during the telecast. But during TV timeouts, a bunch of guys were going out and like tamping down the divots that were being taken up during the game. The swamp is going to be an interesting week for the turf guys to try to fix things up for Kentucky next week, because the field took a beating and it was wet. So yeah, I mean, it was wet on the field, it was wet in the grass. It stopped during the game, which was great, because that meant that there was no excuse for throws going all over the place. But it meant like it felt like you had just gotten out of the shower. And it was it wasn't hot. I mean, it wasn't cool either, but it wasn't hot, but it was awful. And before the sun went down, it just like that whole first quarter. So Florida got dominated in time of possession, everything but the first quarter. They absolutely dominated the time of possession in the first quarter. That was the quarter to dominate, because that just sort of established that, oh, well, Utah's going to be completely exhausted by the end, because they basically just did like a Peloton workout in a bathtub. Like that's what it felt like.
In a bathtub.
That's what it felt like when you're out there, man. It was intense.
Well, let's hope whatever the turf guys did for Tavian Thomas slipping on the goal line there, cutting to his left on second and goal. Let's keep that going, whatever that was on Saturday. But Will, hey, without getting carried away here, there's a level of significance to this win. Obviously, big win. Pac-12 champions coming to town. Been talking about this game all off season, and this is not a typical opener for the Gators, but we've talked about it a lot on this show, and we Gator Nation as a whole, really. You talk about the fans surrounding the program, everything. It's just been a bad little bit of a dark cloud, a little bit of grumpiness going on here for about a year and a half, I'd say. Like since that Cotton Bowl loss, it's just kind of been hanging over. But the ugly loss to LSU, the shoot throw wasn't good. Some of those losses in 2020, you just walked away with a bad taste in your mouth, and then 2021. got away, was, a runaway train off a bad track last year. But Napier's hire sparked the optimism. We had a little panic over the summer with the recruiting, but there's been progress there. I think a lot of people are happy with where that is and where the direction's going. And then you see this win come out here on a game where, even though, look, hey, we read your article, we'll talk about the stats in a minute, where the Gators definitely deserved to win that game statistically. It just kind of feels like you stole one a little bit there at the end, because how many times you making that play out of 100 in the end zone in that situation? But how significant do you think this win is for that general mood of the program? Now, you also said it this way too. You go out and lose to Kentucky on Saturday and everything changes, but this is a real good step in the right direction, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I think when you looked at the season and you said, where's Florida going to stay? Where's Florida going to be at the end of the year? Like the over under for the Gators was what, around 6.5, 7? And this significantly changes that, because I think anybody who put them at 6.5 just penciled this one as a loss. And as you looked at it more and more throughout the offseason, you said, well, geez, these teams weren't really that far apart last year. And so if Anthony Richardson can step up and can really be the upgrade that we think he can be to Emory Jones, well, then Florida's really got an opportunity here. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, Richardson steps up. He has an unbelievable game, carries him, even though he only throws for 168 yards. And Florida's offense really moved at a top 10 clip when you look at advanced stats and how they were able to move the ball. Now, certainly you had some issues there along the way, but that to me is the significance, is Florida did not play a clean game. Florida really shot themselves in the foot multiple times. I mean, there's like the 3rd and 5 where they had driven from their own end zone. They're sitting at midfield, or they're sitting at like the 45 of Utah, get a false start on 3rd and 5, and then Richardson has to throw the ball away. Almost throws an interception when he's drifting when he throws against his body. But 3rd and 5 is very, very different than 3rd and 10. That false start kills you. There's obviously the fumble on the opening drive that gets returned back the other direction. And there were a bunch of holding calls on kickoff returns that brought the ball back to like the 10-yard line. So Florida's average starting field position was actually inside its own 20 for the entire game. So you look at all the little things that can get better, and you still got the win. I think that's the thing that I take from it, is Utah's a quality opponent. There were some people in my section chanting overrated after the interception. I'm like, no, don't say that. Like, that's a good high quality team. They finished 12th in the country last year. They brought a lot of people back. Tavian Thomas and Cam Rising were the two guys that you looked at along with the tight ends and said, that's why this offense is going to move. And sure enough, those were the guys who moved the ball. And so I think Florida beat a properly rated team. I think Utah's going to end up somewhere between 10 and 15th at the end of the year when you look at it, after they've gone and beaten a bunch of quality teams in the Pac-12. Does that mean Utah is Alabama or Georgia? No, it doesn't. But it's a high-quality win against a high-quality team when you went out there and didn't play your best in terms of execution. This wasn't like, oh, Florida did everything right and all the discipline things got fixed, and Napier's discipline and process brings a perfect game for the Gators to the Swamp, and they just get out by the skin of their teeth. That's not what happened here. What happened here is that Florida was the far superior team, other than discipline and mistakes. And Utah actually played an incredibly clean game until that last drive with Rising. And there were multiple throws on that possession that might have been intercepted. And until you put the ball in Rising's hands, Utah was just buzzsawing Florida up and down the field that second half with their running backs, which is exactly what you would expect them to do. So what I take from this is, yeah, the tone of the program is elated, right? Because you got a win that, like you said, maybe you weren't expecting, especially coming into the year. I think people were sitting there going, look, as long as we look good, as long as there's an improvement, as long as those sorts of things start to show, we'll take a loss at Utah. We want to see progress. That's what we want to see. So we saw progress. We saw hope at the quarterback position. And we also saw a team that has a lot of way to go when it comes to progressing. And so you look at that and you get excited about the rest of the year because of the way this one went. Because if you can take that if you could package the good stuff and start to eliminate the bad things, and Napier even said this in his press conference after the game, is he expects to see an enormous improvement between the first game and the second game. And if we see an enormous improvement, this is a team that's going to be able to blow the doors off some teams in the SEC.
Yeah, so I had my parents over watching the game too, and I said to them after the game, I'm like, "What's the tone of the conversation if Rising throws the touchdown on that last pass instead of an interception? It'd be a lot different conversation this week here because there's plenty. Like that's why I wanted to open the show to explicitly celebrate the victory because awesome, you got the win, you got the win, you got it done, you made the play, great job." But there's plenty to pick at here, and we'll start that in 4 bits here, where we start analyzing the offense against the Utah defense. And first off here, Will, Anthony Richardson, you talked about him here. He was everything we wanted him to be. Obviously, electric on the ground. Great touchdown run before the half. It reminded me of when I played NCAA football in the video games there, and you had that one quarterback. You finally recruited that great quarterback, right? And you just would just torture anyone who played man defense if you had a running quarterback, right? And then the jump twirl fake for key 2-point conversion, which you look at the score, was crucial. The guy was unbelievable top to bottom. Now, did he make his mistakes? Did he throw one up that should have been intercepted? Yeah. Did they also run a game plan that was fairly what did you think about the game plan overall for Richardson, Will? What did you think about him through the air? Because I think we can all agree man's electric on the ground. I don't think that needs a lot of conversation. So what did you think about him through the air and how much of what we saw on Saturday is sustainable throughout the season?
I mean, so he averaged 7 yards an attempt, which is a little bit less than what he averaged last year. He was around 7.9. I think he was better in the first half than he was in the second half through the air. I think they limited his reads specifically on those flood plays where they ran play action and he rolled out to his right, and then he had a short, medium, and long read. What I will say is I thought he had some guys open on the long read that you probably can't see on the actual broadcast.
Mm-hmm.
I thought he had some guys open or could have taken some shots in one-on-one deep in those flood concepts. I think he'd clearly been coached for this specific game for what they were trying to do. Hey, let's hit that intermediate guy if he's open and just take the 12 yards and move on. Thought Ricky Pearsall was probably the only threat that he hit. I think Pearsall might be the only guy he hit with a throw when it wasn't a flare pass out to the side or when it wasn't one of those flood plays where he was rolling out on play action. At the same time,
Almost by design though, right?
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
and I think, look, he's still learning the offense just like anybody else is. He's not going to be a maestro at it. But what I look at is, Cam Rising, who's known that offense at Utah for years, had a QB rating of 129.5. Richardson had a QB rating of 129.6. So he was equivalent to Rising through the air. And then he had the 45-yard touchdown explosive play that Rising good running the ball, right? 7 for 91. I mean, he had a good day running the ball. At the same time, Richardson 11 for 106, but that 45-yard run that puts you at a place where you say, okay, yeah, like he is he outperformed or was equivalent to Rising through the air, which is really what you needed because you figured you were going to get a win on the ground between Richardson and Rising. That's exactly what you got. Now it was really close in terms of those two guys play, but it took Rising 32 throws to get to 216 yards. It took Richardson 24 to get to 168. So he actually had a higher per pass average, and Utah's a pretty good defense. And so I can envision that this is one of the tougher defenses he's going to play. And considering that his last start against a good defense in Georgia, Richardson just sort of fell apart. This gives me a lot of hope moving forward because that LSU game was something where you're like, yeah, but LSU wasn't all that great. And then you had the USF game where you're like, yeah, but it's USF, and same thing with FAU. And, then there were a couple of games, the Kentucky game, he didn't really get an opportunity. The Florida State game was a little bit pedestrian, and granted, he hurt his knee in that game, but still a little bit pedestrian.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I'm looking at it and I'm going, this guy in his first day as the real starter came in against a pretty good defense and played pretty well. Is there area for growth? Absolutely. But I think that's one of the things about going from the first game to the second game. And one of the reasons why it's such a big deal to get a win over Utah in game one, as opposed to going out and throwing for 350 yards against, Texas Southern. Like, this establishes that Richardson is special. And now the stats are going to follow when he gets an opportunity against some teams that aren't as good as Utah.
Yeah, does on a big stage too. A lot of national attention for Richardson going forward. Felt like the nation. There's still some people you're hearing national pundits talk about it, where a lot of national pundits will acknowledge, like, yeah, we heard of the guy, but man, that was something that like you just seeing people catch on a little bit more on a national level. Hey, the running game, I thought, obviously Richardson contributed to that. You pointed it out in your article, your post game article. Anybody who hasn't taken a look at that, be sure to check out Will's analysis on readreaction.com. He actually diagrams the plays for you there. But Richardson holding the defensive end on a lot of those replays definitely has an impact. But the offensive line did a nice job. They created some space for these guys. And I'll tell you what, Will, the running backs, they combined on 27 carries for 178 yards and a touchdown. Montreal Johnson leads the way, 12 carries, 75 yards, and that touchdown, including just a beautiful cutback that opened the field wide, just completely wide open on the right side for a score there I believe it was the third quarter there. ETN, 5 carries, 64 yards, but he had a long of 21, really broke it open there on that run, broke a tackle and took it up the right side. And Naquan Wright, pedestrian, 10 carries for 39 yards, but they went to him on that final drive. He got the first 3 carries on that final drive, Will. So it tells you what they think of him, that they're putting him in a key situation there. So no Lingard. That's really, we talked about these 4 guys in addition to Bowman, who obviously transferred throughout the offseason. Lingard was not a factor on Saturday night, but a little bit of sample of what we see with the rotation. Looks like Montreal Johnson. I could see that becoming the consistent guy, even though the carries are relatively evenly split. And if you factor in Richardson, you got almost a 4-headed monster in that running game.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is that Richardson is a huge deal when it comes to this running game. Being able to hold the linebackers and making everybody pay attention to him, that certainly opens things up. I think the offensive line really, we've talked a lot during the offseason about Ethan White being a big key to the left side. And if you think about where they ran the ball most of the time last year, it was to the left side of the offensive line. The other night when they needed it at the end of the game, they went right. They went right behind Osiris Torrance every time they needed yards in that game. Everything was to the right that final drive. And Richardson actually is going to have an opportunity to pull the ball a few more. He's going to look at the film and go, "Ooh, I had an opportunity to hold it." The defensive end crashed on a few of those, and I probably could have popped a big one. But they were still able to run the ball, even with Montreal Johnson, especially when he came in for Wright. I think, look, I'm not sure how well it translated on TV. When I went back and rewatched it, I didn't see the same thing that I saw live, but they got something with ETN. I mean, ETN, I think, has the capability of potentially being the best back in the team by, a week or two from now. Like, he had a burst in that first half, especially, where you looked at and went, "Oh, like, that's different."
Mm-hmm.
And Montreal Johnson has the ability to hit the hole. I think he knows the scheme better. I think he knows exactly what he needs to do. I think ETN is going to have a couple of plays where he maybe tries to make more of something than he should and maybe gets caught for a loss. And that may be one of the reasons why Johnson gets the ball significantly. But at least in this game specifically, ETN, his jump cuts were awesome. The speed and the ferocity with which he made those. If you give him space, he's going to get you 12 to 15 yards. He's capable. He sort of has the power, I think, to get past the sort of initial swarm of defenders if there's a guy in the hole, but then he's got the speed to take advantage of it. And a guy like Wright has the speed to take advantage of it in the open field. But if there's a missed block, doesn't necessarily have the capability of being able to cut and get open and get to the open field. ETN's the guy I'm most excited about coming out of the game. Montreal Johnson obviously puts the game away, or at least is a huge factor in the last 2 drives going down the field. But ETN is the guy that I look at and say, when the big plays come in the running game, and they're going to come because this offensive line is going to gel and get even better. And I thought they played pretty well. And then you've got Anthony Richardson, who's going to hold people on the back end with the different read options. The big plays are going to come. And I think ETN is the guy that jumped out at me live. You just looked at it and said, "That guy's different. I see why he's on the depth chart." And by the end of the game, I wasn't worried about Lorenzo Lingard. I was like, "Get ETN out there," till he fumbled the ball on the one play going down the field. But even that one, I mean, that was an impressive run to get to where he needed to get to.
It's a
And
lucky recovery.
now you just got to work on the ball security. But hey, he's a hero because he jumped on it at the end, and
Yeah.
we're talking about him in lauding terms because he jumped on it. Though obviously he was the only guy who was going to get that one. So if he jumped on it and it squirted out, it was going to be bad news for the Gators. But obviously able to get on it, and so look, 5 for 64 with a long at 21. It wasn't like he hit 1 60-yard run and then had 4 runs for a yard each.
Yeah.
They were like 20 and 12 and 14 and 17.
Steady.
So he was able to hit the hole exclusively or extensively. I was really impressed with ETN.
I do like this mix of backs too, because they bring enough differences to the table. I mean, Johnson, even that first fumble Johnson had, the man fumbled because he's running over 3 other dudes and a safety who's a really good player. Cole Bishop for Utah comes up, heads up play. He left the ball a little bit available. Great strip. That was more of a good play by the defense than a bad play by the offense. But even saw later in the game, someone on Twitter, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting who it was. So sorry, I'm not crediting you here, but that someone on Twitter pointed out the difference when he was running later in the game. You saw him covering up with 2 hands, shows coaching. That guy grew from the mistake. So look, mistakes are going to happen. You're going to fumble the ball once in a while, but showing progress there down the stretch, and they obviously had plenty of confidence to go to Montrell Johnson over and over again. But I did like the it just feels like there's enough difference between Johnson, ETN, Wright, and then you factor in Richardson in that running game. It's going to be tough to stop this year, Will.
I mean, end of the year, I think when it really comes down to crunch time, you're going to have Richardson and ETN back there. And I think we should be really comfortable with that. Those are going to be 2 guys who can get you an explosive play at any time in the backfield. And Johnson will be the guy that they sort of bring in to pummel you at the end. But I really do think that when Florida needs to go explosive, and you even saw it, they threw to ETN a couple of times, 2 for 9 on the throws. But he's eventually going to get an opportunity out in space on a throw where the defensive backs aren't able to do or the linebackers aren't able to do the job that Utah was able to do. He's going to break one out there too. He's earned his way into the starting lineup. And I think that's one of the things I take away from this game is that guys who really showed out in camp are getting opportunities. So a guy like
it's a little
ETN,
bit different from the last administration, huh?
A little bit. I mean, you think about Shamar James was out there a lot at linebacker too. So there's guys who are getting opportunities, and look, you can't say it's not merit based if you've got a true freshman out there at big times, and Florida, I think, has found some stuff here with a couple of these guys.
Let's talk about the Billy Napier effect on Saturday. We talked about it. We won't go so far as to call it a totally clean effort on Saturday, but in terms of the effort level itself, I thought the effort level was awesome, steady. He talked about the fight in this group. Lots of fight in this group. They fought down to the very end, which is why the game ended the way it did. But let's talk about Billy Napier effect here. Big time decision to go for it on 4th down in a couple of yards there in the first quarter that leads to the opening TD. I was almost like, kick the field goal, man. Just let's take the points on this one. But trusted Richardson to get it done. Rolled him out. Richardson threw the ball. I thought he could have just run for the first down there, but Johnson makes the catch, takes it down to almost the pylon inside the 2-yard line there.
Yeah, I mean, going forward on 4th down there is the right call, obviously, from an analytics perspective. But I get why people take the points. In fact, there was a 4th and 2 later in the game for Utah where they had an opportunity to go up 17-7, and instead Whittingham, Utah tries to draw Florida off sides. Florida's able to sort of hold steady. They could take the delay of game, go back 5 yards, and kick the field goal. And to me, that was actually where Florida won the game, is where Whittingham didn't make the decision to go for it on 4th down there. You obviously have the 4th down stop later in the game, but it was that one to me that completely changed the tone. And so Napier did the same thing, right? I mean, he's already down 7-0. He's heading down 7-3. Feels a lot like, in that Alabama game last year, they settled for a field goal after a long drive down into deep in Alabama territory, and it goes 7-3, and then Alabama was able to put up two touchdowns, and it's 21-3 before Florida sort of got its sea legs underneath it. In this game, Florida got it to 7-7, And then, Utah puts a couple of field goals up, but it's still everything's within reach, even though it hadn't really felt like Florida had figured out exactly, like they were hitting on 3 of the 4 cylinders, but it was like there was a little bit of like a hiccup every once in a while when the engine was running. And then by the time we got to the second half, there weren't any hiccups anymore. The engine was running pretty well. So, look, that one specifically sticks in my mind. There are a couple of things I think that stick in my mind that Napier's going to need to improve on. I thought just going into the half, when you got 41 seconds, you're up 14-13. Richardson just electrified the crowd with a huge run. Your defense just got to stop. There was an opportunity to potentially get 3 points there by trying to go down the field. At least give it you had the opportunity to run out the clock, even if you had a first down incompletion, or you could throw like a swing pass and give somebody an opportunity. Instead, they just hand the ball to Wright, gain a couple of yards, a 10-second runoff that they accepted because Utah had an injury, and they run out the clock. I think that was something that was going to be criticized. And then on the last drive of the game, they let the clock run down on 4th and 2 and called a timeout. And that was interesting to me because you call the timeout in that situation to make sure you're in the right play. Okay, but that means you've just committed to this being the drive, because there were like 2 minutes and 10 seconds, something like that left when he allowed that to happen, which meant that you weren't going to really have time to have a drive. You're going to be basically 41 seconds and no timeouts if you happen to not get the 4th down. And that was something where I'm like, you'd like to be ready for that so that you don't have to call a timeout. At the same time, that's sort of pick and niche. You want the right play call, because you're better off having a good play call there than you are necessarily turning it over on 4th down and then having to stop them, because I'm not sure Florida's defense was going to make a stop at that point, even with 3 timeouts. And that's probably what the calculus was there.
Yeah, I definitely saw some chirping online about the time management in this one. 7 penalties for 38 yards, but there was a little different feel with these penalties. Well, there wasn't a lot of this. I feel like the last few years, it's been a lot of like critical 3rd downs. You're getting a holding call on the defense or a pass interference or something. Didn't see many of those. There's plenty of opportunities. We shot ourselves in the foot plenty, but just didn't feel like we did it in a big way with penalties. I know you talked about it impacting field position. That's certainly important, but didn't feel like they popped up on those critical 3rd downs, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree a little bit. I think that just about every drive that you look at that Florida struggled on, or that they didn't score, was marred by something. I mean, you got the opening drive with a fumble. They had a punt on they had a punt on their second drive where they had 24 yards in the drive, but they were pinned back because of a penalty. There you have the touchdown. Then you got the 3 and out where again they were pinned back like inside their own 10 because of a penalty, which leads to a short field goal for Utah. They only had to go 25 yards. Then you've got a touchdown. Then you've got on 4 plays with the Richardson long run. Then you get the end of the half where they waste the 41 seconds. Then you go into the second half. They get the ball at the 1. They go all the way down the field to midfield, and then they have a false start that ends that game, or ends that drive, even though they're in Utah territory. And then it's touchdown, end of game. So you only had 8 real possessions when you say, look, the end of half they ran the clock out, end of the game they ran the clock out. They had 8 possessions, 4 of which ended in a touchdown, 1 that ends in the fumble, and then they had 3 punts, and each one of those had a penalty or bad field position associated with it. And so I think the lesson there is that Florida has the opportunity to be explosive on the offensive side of the ball, but you can't make yourself go 90 yards every time you need to score. You're just not going to be able to do that. You're not going to be consistent enough to be able to do that. And the average starting field position for Florida was inside its own 20. And the average starting field position for Utah was like, I think 64 yards from pay dirt. And that's the difference. That's why that game was close. The game was close because Utah could go 25 yards and kick a field goal, and Florida could go 25 yards and they were at their own 30 and punting over to Utah. And so from a points, like the expected points from where the team took over, Florida had a distinct disadvantage. So they need to start calling fair catches on kickoffs and not running it back to the 19-yard line. They need to stop getting penalties when they do decide to run the kickoff. And they need to do a better job on the punt game of not allowing, if they're punting from their own territory, you got to flip the field. You can't allow Utah to take the ball over at the 35, 36-yard line, wherever that was after the punt when they were deep in their own territory. All things that will improve, I'm sure, as the season progresses, but things that seem minor at the time. You're like, it's a penalty. We started our own 10. Completely flips the field, right? And you're not able to, you end up giving Utah points because of that particular penalty, rather than just starting at the 25, gaining 10 or 15 yards in your drive. Hey, we got a punt. And now you pin Utah deep. And that just never really happened. There was very little pinning of Utah deep. In fact, the only time they pinned them deep was after they got the stop on downs. They pinned them deep. And then Utah at that point, Florida had a gas defense, and Utah was able to drive right down the field.
Well, transitioning here into 6 bits, and you mentioned all the penalties there. You're talking mainly offense and special teams. We've seen that from the defensive side a lot the last couple of years. Those big penalties. I did not feel like we saw that on Saturday here, but not many. The other thing too, Will, not many glaringly obvious missed assignments. I know the 2021 team. The one thing you can say they improved on from 2020 is they cleaned up those. There wasn't those third and longs where a guy was running wide open like happened in 2020 a lot. But this team really, you just didn't see too many. I know they had the little flare pass and a little swing pass there in the almost like a wheel route in the red zone that I think it was Torrance came over and made a great tackle on where the guy was wide open almost. But outside of that play, you saw Keefe, even when Keefe's making a lot of those catches, he's fairly well covered. Like he's very like the last drive, saw a little bit of guys running open here and there on little underneath routes and stuff, but I didn't see the just the glaringly obvious missed assignments throughout the game on a widespread basis. I thought it was a little cleaner than what we've seen the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think you saw there was one play in particular that sticks out to me where they decided to blitz Torrance from deep, and he got up to the line of scrimmage and timed his blitz actually pretty well. And that meant they had to rotate out a linebacker and rotate the safety down to sort of occupy the space or the other safety over to occupy the space that was being vacated by Torrance. And Torrance came in, didn't really get all that much pressure on the quarterback, but it was a different look, and it caused Rising to sort of throw the ball on the ground. If Rising had made a good throw, that might have been a big play for Utah, but still, you had guys in position to make the play. It wasn't like he was just wide open. Look, I mean, maybe he's a step slow getting over there. And I think that's maybe the one of the reasons why Utah was able to move the ball the way they were, beyond just Florida's defense being tired at the end, is that between the 20s, Florida looked to be a little bit slow in terms of what they were doing. They were doing the right things. They were doing their job, but they were maybe a half step slow, a half beat slow in terms of making their decisions. Once they got into the red zone, as things compressed, I think they were able to still be slow or be that half beat slow, but then you're able to recover because there's such limited space in that particular space that you're able to do that. The other thing is that at that point you just start firing, because if you screw up and, let's say you're playing press coverage and you screw up and the guy gets behind you, well, he's not going that far. Like there's an opportunity to recover there because the field compresses. And I think that to me is maybe the takeaway. If I was going to say positives on the defensive side of the ball, well, there are two positives. One is that they gave up 6.3 yards per play to a Utah team that averaged 6.2 last year. Mm-hmm. So basically Utah's offense was exactly in line with what they were last year. And I don't think we expected Florida's defense to be a top 10 defense. I think we expected, what we're asking for is, can you be average? And if you're giving up the exact same numbers that Utah had last year for an offense, it's very, very similar to what it was last year. I think you can be comfortable with that. I think it also sort of indicates that Utah's going to, it does say that Utah probably is the same team they were last year. And this was a very, really, really quality offense that you played. So that's the first thing. And then the other thing is that I think that's going to speed up. The little half beat being slow is going to speed up. And so the place where Florida killed them, which was 8 of 13 on third downs, is going to be the thing that's going to improve as they move into the regular season. So Utah was able to move the ball. Obviously, the defense did not get a lot of stops, but I think that those stops are going to come as between the 20s they start to speed up their decision making. I think the thing that encourages me is that the decision making was quality enough that they were able to get the stops in the red zone. And so now when those stops start to equate down the field and you get the ball back 2 or 3 more times, again, I don't think you're going to be elite, but I think you're going to be able to get the ball back more times than they did against Utah. And with the way this offense is playing with Anthony Richardson, that's going to give you an opportunity to win just about every game you're in if you can just be average.
Well, we saw Utah also post a goose egg in the statistical column. I have a feeling there's a common thread here. Two quarterbacks that know how to escape pressure. Cam Rising, tough target there to get a sack. No sacks in week one for Patrick Toney's defense. But Will, do you expect those numbers to pick up? Did you like what you saw from the simulated pressures from Toney? I thought it was, you saw the safeties come in late. You saw, like, I mean, well timed, but I'm talking about creeping up to the line. They would slowly creep up in the last second. They go full speed on a blitz there. You saw some stunts with the linebackers. You saw Ventrell Miller coming in a few times. I think you play a less mobile quarterback, you're going to get a few sacks a game here with this new scheme from Patrick Toney.
Yeah, I think they're going to get Levis a few times next week. I think
Yeah,
there's no doubt
fully
about
expected.
that. I
Yep.
think that you could tell that Rising was uncomfortable, that he didn't always
Mm-hmm.
know where the pressure was coming from in the first half. I think and then on the last drive, I think you could say the same thing. I mean, look, I think Cam Rising played a decent game. I don't think he was great. And I think some of that is attributable to the Florida defense, but let's not sugarcoat it. Rising almost threw the first pass of that last drive to Ventrell Miller to start with. He happens to complete it on the sidelines, but that looked like it went right through Miller's hands from where I was standing. Then he throws one right into Miller's hands on the very next play. And I'm sitting there going, oh, we aren't winning this game after that. Like, there's
Just
no
didn't feel
way
like
after
it.
dropping that one. And then obviously the poor decision on the throw to Keithy there, trying to fit it in with Bernie getting the interception. Now I think Bernie, I was actually worried. I thought Bernie, I was like, there's no way he caught that. And the whole Florida sideline comes racing out onto the field. Everybody's celebrating. I'm like, oh, there's going to be 3 15-yard flags here, and Utah's going to have first and goal from the 1 or the half-yard line because they're going to go review this thing and it's going to be overturned. But man, he did. He got his hands underneath it, and that was fantastic. But so yeah, I thought that Florida, especially at the defensive end position, was able to get pressure. I thought Utah got away with a lot of holding. And especially when Rising was trying to make his way outside the pocket, they were allowing the offensive linemen to slow people down. Florida didn't need that with Richardson that much, but there was a lot of holding. And in fact, the fact that they called Naquan Wright for holding on a deep shot that Richardson took and then didn't call some of the penalties on Utah, I think suggested to me that I don't know. I didn't feel I felt like the running back got treated differently than the offensive lineman did, put it that way. The place I would say that Florida needs to improve, and I'm not sure that they can, is I didn't think there was not a lot of push up front. Gervon Dexter had 5 tackles, but he only had 1 QB hurry, no tackles for loss. With as often as Utah ran the ball, the fact that they only have tackles for loss from Trey Dean and then Brenton Cox and Ventrell Miller have a half, and that it was never 2nd and 12. Like, that they never were able, like, there were some run blitzes in there and they just didn't get home. And Tavion Thomas was getting positive yardage. It felt like it was 2nd and 6 or 2nd and 4 a lot. And part of that was Utah came in and brought in extra tight ends and extra offensive linemen. But part of that is that you're just looking at it going, look, beyond Bernie, there's just not a whole lot of push. I mean, Tyreek Sapp played okay. Desmond Watson played okay. You look at, Jalen Lee has 1 tackle. There weren't a whole, like, you start looking at who's on the defensive line who got rotated in and actually got tackles. There's just not a lot of guys in the box score, and that's gonna have to change. They're gonna have to get some pressure up the middle, and they weren't able to do that.
One of the things I did find interesting about Tony's defense here is it's pretty consistent where he's got 3 guys with their hands in the dirt. And I actually went through, because we've been talking, one of the big storylines all offseason has been you got Gervon Dexter and then who along the defensive line, because Brenton Cox, we're calling him an edge rusher, outside linebacker / defensive lineman when he puts his hand down. But Cox doesn't put his hand down a whole lot in the dirt here. And you saw Antoine Powell, Ryland Jr., you saw him do the same thing, where he was often standing on the edge there. Did find it interesting, though, Will, on the final drive, each of those guys, I think throughout the game, I counted 8 times where Cox put his hand in the dirt to rush. Did 4 of it on the last drive, though. And same with Powell. Powell was in on that last drive a lot. 4 out of those 10 plays, he's got his hand in the dirt as well. But this is something we saw throughout in terms of rotation overall, because I know we talked a lot about Chris McClellan potentially playing a lot as a true freshman this year. But It was pretty much who you would expect it to be in terms of the upperclassmen. You saw a lot of Dexter. Obviously, I counted him almost twice as many snaps as anyone else along the defensive front here. But a steady rotation of U-Man Milan, Big Desmond Watson, Tyreek Sapp, who looks like that guy just looks like a missile in human form when he lines up. Doesn't he? He looks unbelievable when he gets lined up. Jalen Lee got plenty of action, and then lesser so Justice Boone in on that rotation. Mentioned Powell, and then you saw Chris McClellan. He was only in really for a couple of series, limited playing time. Didn't ask much from the freshman there. Will, I did find it interesting though, on 2 of the last 3 drives, Watson and Sapp picked up about half of their snaps on the day. So they seemed to like what they had going with Watson and Sapp, although Watson did not play I didn't count a snap for him on the final drive there. Will, what do you think about that rotation overall for the defensive front? And let me ask you something with the scheme. You talked about bringing the pressure from different places. We saw Torrance blitzing a little bit. We saw the safeties coming in, saw the linebackers coming in. How much of it is by design that Dexter and Watson are just meant to be guys that clog up the middle and not necessarily get that push? You obviously want a push from everybody, but how much of that is by design?
I mean, so I think from the standpoint of the last drive, that tells you a little something about how much of it's by design. You mentioned they have Cox with his hand in the ground, the last drive that you've got. You're trying to get pass rush there. You're trying to make Rising uncomfortable that last drive. And that's the group they're going to have out there, or the preferred group they're going to have out there when the defense needs, or when the defense knows that the offense has to throw.
Mm-hmm.
So if the offense can get up, I think then you can be pretty comfortable that they're going to bring some pressure, that they're going to be able to do some things. I think where it becomes problematic is that they couldn't stop the run at all. So if you've got these guys who presumably are there to just plug holes in the middle, they're not necessarily plugging those holes the way you would like to. Now, look, Tavion Thomas is a good player. Utah's offensive line is a good offensive line. They were able to run the ball against a lot of folks last year, and they didn't have an awesome per rush average. They went 39 for 230, so over 5 a play. But Florida went 39 for 283. So in comparison, that's really where the differentiation in terms of each team comes in from an offensive perspective. They're going to need more from their defensive tackles. That's just the way it is. I mean, yes, when the passing downs come, you have to be able to get push up the middle. You're not just there to stand there and occupy a blocker. You got to occupy 2. Allow Brenton Cox to go one-on-one, where when he fights to the inside on a move, there isn't a guard there to get him. You've got to have the ability to make people respect what you're doing up the middle. And I don't think that was there, at least not for you. Utah clearly was focused on Cox. They were focused on keeping the defensive ends from doing damage, and they weren't real worried about the defensive tackles. They stopped the run okay in the first half. I mean, if you look at yards per attempt in the run game for Utah, it's 2.3 in the first quarter, 4.3 in the second, 6.1 in the third, and 9.7 in the fourth. And so that to me indicates that these guys, when fresh, are going to be able to get the job done. The question is what we basically said all offseason. Are you going to be able to keep them fresh? And the Swamp was not a condition where you were going to keep anybody fresh, and they didn't have a bunch of guys in the rotation that they were to bring in and keep fresh. So we'll see. I mean, obviously we got Kentucky coming up. We'll talk about it in a couple of minutes. Kentucky's got some issues there in terms of their run game as well, but that means that this team should be able to take a step up in terms of what they're doing on the defensive tackle. They should be able to rotate more guys in, should be able to get more run for the guys who maybe are younger, and we'll see. Maybe one of them is going to step up. Maybe Chris McClellan will step up. Maybe Jalen Lee will step up. Maybe one of those guys is going to start to become what they need up front, at least as a supplementary piece. But at least coming out of this one, I go, yeah, we thought the defensive line, especially the interior defensive line, was going to be a weakness. And I think we walk out of it going, yeah, some people saw some stuff on film that they're going to look at and try to exploit later on in the year, because that is a place where Florida is thin and doesn't necessarily have an enormous amount of playmakers.
Yeah, the second half was absolutely concerning. It was a tale of 2 halves. I wrote an article on that. That was one of my sections of my article here that we're posting in the next day or two on readandreaction.com. Tale of 2 halves after opening the first half with a touchdown drive off that turnover. The defense allowed only one drive longer than 25 yards and forced Utah to settle for 2 field goals off their 2 best drives of the day, outside of that opening 25-yard touchdown drive set up by the offense's turnover. But 11 plays, 50 yards field goal, 8 plays, 25 yards field goal. That's a pretty nice outing there in the first half for the Florida defense against a tough Utah offense here. We're going to talk about the goal line stand. We're going to talk about the interception to close things out. Those 2 plays should get a lot of love, will get a lot of love. But you mentioned it earlier. You alluded to it earlier. And I want to say on that fourth Utah drive, there was a 3rd and 3 from the Florida 8-yard line where Florida ends up forcing the field goal. It was actually one of the plays you pointed out in your article where the Utah just threw a swing pass and Florida covered it really well. Torrance comes up and makes the tackle, but there's about 3 other guys in line to make the tackle. If Torrance doesn't make it, I think this is a huge moment. You talked about Whittingham not going for it and choosing to go for the field goal instead. I think this moment is just as big as that goal line stand, as that interception, because you could now point to 3 separate drives. Utah had 9 total drives on the game. 3 separate drives. They go inside the Florida 10-yard line. They come away with a total of 3 points thanks to that play right there. It was really the ultimate bend but don't break from this defense here, Will. And as frustrating as it was watching them drive down the field at times, and as much as you sit here going, I mean, as soon as we scored the final drive, we'll talk about the second half next, so I don't want to get too much of the second half here. I just didn't trust this defense yet to absolutely shut things down when you got the win in hand. Some defenses you do trust. This defense doesn't have my trust yet, but give credit where credit's due in making the plays with their heels on the paint. Well, like they got it done 3 times inside the 10-yard line. I think once you could call it a fluke, 2 might be super lucky, but you do it 3 times, that's a bit of a pattern there, isn't it?
Well, I mean, so look, I think obviously it was disappointing they weren't able to hold after the initial fumble on the first drive. You were sitting there going, "Come on, just hold them to a field goal," and it didn't take them very long to get in the end zone. And in fact, I was a little bit surprised they didn't call targeting on Florida. I'd have to go look at the replay, but dude's helmet comes off, and I'm sitting there going, "Oh no, that's like, are we going to get a safety kicked out right to start the game?" But anyway, they get the touchdown. Then Florida punts, and Utah punts back, but then Florida gets the touchdown, right? So it's 7-7. But then Utah drives down the field, 11 plays, 50 yards. But again, bend but don't break. They're able to stop and force a long field goal, right? It was like 40, 43 yards, somewhere in that range.
Yeah.
Utah makes that. But now comes the field position, right? The kickoff from Utah, the penalty, pins Florida deep. Florida's really conservative. 2 Naquan Wright runs, and then a little swing pass to Xavier Henderson goes nowhere. So they get -2 yards on that drive. And then a poor punt, right? I mean, the punt went about 40 yards in the air, but the guy was able to catch it on the run, and it went to the wrong side. I actually thought it might go for a touchdown because you could see the punt coverage was supposed to go to the right and the punt went to the left. And I'm like, uh-oh, like he didn't punt it to the right side to the correct side of the field. And so, Utah takes over the ball, and they were already in field goal range. So Florida gave up a little bit of yards. It's an 8-play drive for 25 yards. Rising runs for a first down in there. That actually is the play I think I was talking about where he misses Keithy with an opportunity with a
couple of missed throws from him on that drive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then you've got that they actually ran the 4th down play on 4th and 2 and weren't able to get it, but Whittingham had called timeout right before the 4th down play. So the Swamp's going nuts, thinking they got the stop, and then the officials come in and are like, well, we let them run the play anyway, but they called timeout beforehand, so everybody's all dejected there. And then they go out and they fake it, right? They go out and they try to draw Florida offsides, and then decide to kick the field goal. And even though it could have been 10-7 if Florida had gotten that stop on 4th down, 13-7 felt like a win. It felt, and then just in a flash, 4 plays, 79 yards. There's 2 big passes. So you got the pass to Xavier Henderson for 15 yards and a pass to Ricky Pearsall for 14, a run for Montrell Johnson for 5, and then Richardson hits the 45-yard run. So positive play, positive play, positive play, positive play. And the offense had been start and stop it. Even the first touchdown drive, they had the holding penalty that put them back, and Richardson had to complete a 3rd and 15. This was the first drive where everything was clean. And at that point you went, oh, like we've played not all that great in the first half and we're still ahead. Like that to me suggests that Florida had not, that was the first time that I felt Florida really had an opportunity. And you know, from then on, Florida really didn't, a couple of little mistakes, but nothing big like the ones that happened in the first half. And that's why they were able to win the game in the second half.
Well, I will say this: the sweet feeling of victory sure helps to cover up some stink here. And for the Gators, that stink mostly lied in the second half. If you break it down, that Utah offense, they put up about 70% of their yardage in the second half of play, and they just slowly and deliberately punched Florida in the gut over and over again. 4 lengthy drives from Utah. And each of them going, we had 11 plays for 71 yards to open the half for Utah. They end up going down to the Florida 1 yard line. Florida makes a goal line stand. Incredible job by that Florida defense. Second drive of the second half here, 9 plays, 89 yards, touchdown. 8th drive of the game here, third drive of the second half, 11 plays, 73 yards, touchdown. And then, of course, the final drive, within a minute, 10 plays, 69 yards, interception in the end zone. But a lot of lengthy drives there from Utah in the second half. Whittington and the Utes, I felt like they were in the first half, they're putting a lot on Cam Rising. They're asking him to really take care of business, when in reality, their best player was Tavion Thomas. We talked about him coming into the game as being the guy to stop. 2021 first team all Pac-12 player, 1,100 yards, 21 touchdowns last season, 6 carries in the first half. And really, it's part of the reason why Florida looks so good defensively is Tavion Thomas was just not in the mix. 21 yards with the longest being a 7-yard burst there. So Utah ends up leaning on Rising. Clearly at halftime, they went in and said, we got to get this guy the ball. Ends up getting 17 attempts in the second half, responds with 94 yards and a touchdown in pretty dominant fashion. You also saw Rising pick up his yardage in the second half as a result, 57 yards on the ground for Rising. And his 29-yard run the last drive, I felt like that should have been the highlight of the night for Utah before he went and threw that interception in the end zone. That's what he's going to be remembered for. But he also had 141 yards passing, most of which 9 receptions, 105 yards and a touchdown to Keefe, the tight end, just tortured Florida for most of the night. So I think this is a great test here for Tony and his defense. And while we can pick on this, it is important to stress college football, name of the game is survival. And they did make the plays when it counted. So though there's plenty to pick at, though there's plenty to look at, credit to the defense for getting it done when it counted. And I do want to stress that. I think we got to look at that from a positive perspective.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a couple things. Is, you know, you talked about it and it felt like Utah was just, you know, pounding Florida, and in some ways they did, but the real difference in the two halves to me was that in the first half, Utah had 0 explosive plays of 20 plus yards. They had 5 in the second half, which meant that there was a backbreaking sort of field position changing play on every single drive. So it was the 28-yard run for Rising on the drive with the interception, but the drive before that had a 20-yard pass to Kincaid. There was the pass to Keefe when they were back deep after Florida had pinned them deep for 37 yards, and then a 26-yard for Rising on that drive as well. And then the first touchdown drive of the half, they had a 22-yard run for Tavion Thomas. So the big plays they were able to catch really sort of put Florida in a position where they weren't able to stop them and keep them out of the end zone because they were able to flip the field so quickly. It wasn't, you didn't make them go 18 plays. Now they only had to go 12. They were able to get it into the end zone that way. The other thing that I would say is that in the preview, and you mentioned this a little bit, but in the preview that I had for Utah very early in the season last year, they were very heavily quarterback oriented in terms of the usage rates for the quarterbacks. They were very low when it came to Tavion Thomas. Against USC, they decided to use Thomas, but they didn't necessarily ramp back the use of their quarterback. They lost then to Oregon State, and they leaned on Rising too much in that game. And I thought what they learned from that was that they needed to lean on Thomas, not on Rising, because what you saw is that the usage rate for Rising went way down for the rest of the year. In fact, it was below 50% and sometimes below 40% in some of their wins, in those games. And Thomas has got up to as high as 36 or 37% in some of those games in terms of overall usage. Well, if you look at the actual usage rates in this game, Rising's usage was 55%, Thomas's was 32. You're like, okay, not too far off from those numbers. But in the first quarter, Rising's usage rate was 70%, Thomas was 20%. In the second quarter, Rising's was 65%, Thomas's was 25%. And then in the third quarter, when Utah finally took over, the usage rate was 25% for Rising and 50% for Thomas. And that was the difference, is they forgot who they were in the first half.
Yep.
In my estimation, they tried to get cute. They tried to be Cam Rising's team when they're really Tavion Thomas's team. They're really an offensive lineman with tight ends who can block and also can get down the field and catch the ball. And instead of trying to build explosive plays to those tight ends off of Tavion Thomas, they were trying to get those plays to begin with. And part of that is I think they were trying to exploit Florida's linebackers early on with the tight ends. And I think in some ways you'd say, look, the tight ends did struggle in coverage from time to time. But I think the bigger thing is that they put a lot on Rising's back, and Rising played okay. He didn't play great. He was slippery. He ran for a lot of yardage. I mean, he averaged like 13 yards a rush or something like that. His yards above replacement, which is my stat to measure this, had him at 1.24, which is good. That's like sort of Jake Fromm. That's not Kyler Murray though. And I think they treated it like it was Kyler Murray there in the first half, and then finally came back and said, all right, we're going to go back to what we are, bread and butter, put the ball on the ground and make Florida stop it. So in some ways, I think that the issues that Florida had were induced by or helped by Utah. But that, to me, the big thing is the explosive plays. They gave up none in the first half. When you don't give up explosive plays, you don't give up points. And quite honestly, 7 of those points weren't their fault. And you could even say 10 of the points weren't their fault, because deep in their own territory, they had a bad punt that put Florida in bad position to be able to stop them. So if this game looks completely differently, if Florida just doesn't shoot themselves in the foot, if Montrell Johnson holds onto that ball and Florida settles for a field goal, and then Utah has to drive the entire field, and let's say Florida's defense is able to stop them at like midfield, and then Florida takes over and scores a touchdown like they did their next drive, and then doesn't get the penalty on the kickoff where they then have to punt and give them great field position. Like, let's say Utah only has 3 points and it's 14-3 at the end of the first half. Like, this looks like a Florida runaway, and that's what all the advanced stats say. They say this should have been Florida in a runaway. The reason it wasn't is because the Utah offense was able to open up those explosive plays in the second half, and then that Florida didn't have a bigger lead in the first half when they maybe should have.
It's crazy the stats say that though, Will, because it just feels like we stole this game a little bit here with those two stops, the goal line stop, the interception at the. I mean, if I'm a Utah fan, I'm looking at that game going, we just handed that to Florida. We gave that away. Like, Utah, they better learn their lesson from this game. It was something you made the comment earlier here too. I actually had already said this. I recorded the reading for my audio article, and one of the comments I made, I didn't write it, but one of the comments I made in my audio article was, hey, don't be I know it's fun to SEC when we play these Pac-12 schools and everything. Yo, this Utah team, very good. I think they're very good. I think they're going to go do great things in the Pac-12 here this season and be very competitive to win that league again this season. We want to see Utah do well, and I think Utah found itself there in the second half. I think they definitely got back closer to their identity, and I don't think they'll forget that. They learned a hard lesson to open the season here. Well, I also want to point out here, I did love this. Billy Napier at halftime, coming out of halftime, he said, we talk about playing with legendary finish. It's time to go do that. And man, did they do that to close this one out, Will. So any final thoughts on the defensive effort here, Will, before we move on to the Kentucky preview?
I mean, I think they did a great job of holding Utah at 7 scoring opportunities, so 7 times inside of Florida's 40, and at least 2 of those were not because of the defense allowing them into that position, and they only gave up 27 or 26 points, so 3.7 points per opportunity. Florida had 5.3 points per opportunity, only had 4 And part of that was due to field position. So I
Mm.
think the field position disadvantage, which everybody looks at and goes, oh, field position. And you usually end up, one team starts 24 yards, starts 75 yards from the touchdown. The other one starts 74. That's not a huge difference. It was 14 yards was the difference in field position, starting field position
Jeez.
for these two teams was the difference between the two of them. And that skews things. And so I think the defense probably is a little bit better than what we think coming out. I think the offense is way better than we thought coming out. I think if this game had played out the exact same way, but Florida had Utah's stats, I'd be sounding alarm bells and going, hey, this is going to be a problem. We did get away with one here. This is something where there's not a lot of room for us to improve. So I sit there and look at Utah, and if I was a Utah fan, I'd be like, man, like Florida gave us every opportunity to take this one, even though they played a better game than us. For all the underlying statistics, we did everything right and they still got the win. That's rough, because if we could have stolen that one, well, that puts us in real position to improve. But still, do we have that top gear? I don't know. Florida, I think what I see coming out of this game is there is a top gear for them to reach, and they never got there. Like, it was like they tried to shift and just like it didn't actually take off. And so if they can fix those things, there is going to be a top gear for this team that is significantly higher than what we saw. So very, very happy with the win. I think there's a lot of things on the defensive side of the ball in particular that need to improve. And I think, honestly, the one place where Florida can just make huge strides, leaps and bounds over the next 4 or 5 days is special teams. If they can get the special teams to where that field position gap closes, I don't even know that it needs to be equivalent, just that it closes, you're going to have a much better shot at a big win, as opposed to just having a holding on at the end for dear life against a good team. I mean, Utah's a very, very good team, but that performance won't get the job done against some of the beasts of the SEC. But that performance, without all the mistakes, might be enough to get the job done against some of those beasts of the SEC. And that's what we're going to have to see moving forward.
Yeah, one final thought on Utah. They're going to definitely circle us with maybe a couple of red circles there to open next season. That's going to be a nice little revenge game for them in Salt Lake City. So putting a note out to the Gator Collective or Gator Guard or whoever handles this stuff, what do we got to do to get Anthony Richardson back next year? What's that looking like? Let's start asking that question, because Anthony Richardson going out to Salt Lake City next year, feeling a lot better about that game, Will.
Yeah, I don't know what the number is, but I'm going to say that it just went up significantly. So that'd be my guess.
Yeah, what can we do to what can we do for you to make you wait on that NFL contract for a year, Anthony? All right, let's move on to a dollar. We'll do a Kentucky look ahead here, and really, it's great to make a statement. I had really framed the Utah last week. We both really framed the Utah game as not the end all be all, but a chance to make a statement on a national stage. Billy Napier, Florida, they certainly made that statement. But we talked about the SEC opener. This is the real test. This is where week 2, Kentucky coming to town. This is where you really want to dig in. You can't, again, you lose this game, all the good feelings get washed aside almost from that Utah win. But you got to take care of business. This is one of those games you just got to hold serve at home against Kentucky. And I really hate this phrase, Will, and I hope to go another. I went the first 3 decades of my life without using it, and I really hope to go another 3 decades without having to use this. But this is a revenge game against Kentucky on Saturday. The Cats, they come in, they opened with the 37-13 win in week 1 over Miami, Ohio. They outpaced the Redhawks 24-3 in the second half after a slow start. Will Levis, preseason darling for all the NFL mock draft nerds out there, one of Mel Kiper's top 25 prospects this season, threw for 303 yards, 3 touchdowns in the opener. The receiving core, Tavion Robinson, he's their Wandell, guys. He's got some scoot to him, dude. He's 6 receptions, 136 yards, long of 45, explosive player. Virginia Tech transfer there, Will. Not sure why the Hokie, how'd he get out of Tech there, Will? What the heck?
I'm saying the same thing about Hendon Hooker.
Yeah, you imagine if you had Robinson and Hooker in Blacksburg, I'm pretty sure they take care of Old Dominion last week. Dane Key and Barry and Brown, also contributors in the passing game as receivers. 13 of Levis's 21 completions went to these 3 receivers. So again, that's Robinson, Key, and Brown. They also accounted for 234 of his 303 yards. Brown, I believe I think Key's a true freshman too. Will, I'm sorry, I should have had that. I know Brown is a true freshman. He opened the second half with a kickoff return for a touchdown. Although he had one of those as he was crossing the line, he's celebrating, he almost dropped the ball. They had to review it on whether or not he dropped it before he crossed the goal line. So that was fun. But we talked about Kentucky being a type of team much like Utah. They want to play physical, play defense, punch in the mouth. Chris Rodriguez is suspended, the starting running back. That's a huge storyline coming into this game. Not listed on the depth chart coming into Gainesville here. The Wildcats only picked up 76 yards on 26 carries against Miami of Ohio. I'm going to repeat that. 76 yards on 26 carries against Miami of Ohio. If you factor out the quarterback lost yardage there, they only netted 50 yards on the ground. That's very not Kentucky-like on the ground here for a Mark Stoops team. Regarding Rodriguez, Will, from Hunter Sullivan of Sports Illustrated's Wildcats Today article, he's quoting Mark Stoops on Monday Presser this week. I don't have anything I can report, Stoops said in his weekly press conference. I've always been transparent with you, tried to be the best I can. Again, I've been advised there's things going on. There's layers to this that I've been advised that I really can't comment on it. It's not like I'm trying to hide things from you. Rodriguez pled guilty to a DUI charge in July, and rumors have also circulated surrounding a, quote, off the field issue, unquote, that would coincide with him not seeing the field for the first few games of the season. Reports have indicated initially that he might miss 3 to 4 games to begin the year, Will. So before we jump in on the Kentucky defense, let's talk about that impact. First off, Will Levis coming into town, couple explosive receivers, but really lacking a running game, a punch in the running game. That's a big difference from Kentucky teams we've seen in the last couple of years.
Well, and it's a problem for Kentucky because that's the way you take advantage of the Florida defense, clearly, is by being able to run the ball. Florida's defensive backfield was very good last year. I think they showed that they're going to be able to be pretty good this year again in the opener against Utah. And so now you've got a team that's going to come in and struggle to run against Miami of Ohio. We could say all we want about the defensive line for Florida and how it may have struggled against Utah, but this is not the defensive line for Miami of Ohio. And so if Kentucky only runs for 76 yards against Florida, this is going to be a blowout. Like, that's just the reality. And I think it's really interesting when you look at it. So all the advanced stats suggest Kentucky was going to win this game the whole way along. Win probability chart is in Kentucky's favor the entire time, but it's 13-10 at the half. Levis actually played pretty well in the first half, but still just 13-10. And then you get the 100-yard kickoff return by Barry and Brown there to open up the second half. Then there's a fumble. And so then they only have to have an 8-yard drive. Now, look, Levis hits the touchdown to Chauncey Magwood, 2 plays, 8 yards, 4 seconds. And all of a sudden it's 27-10. And everybody can go and sort of exhale. I mean, if Florida doesn't make those mistakes, then this, like, and if you don't get the kickoff return and you don't get the turnover, and again, they got them, so you give them credit for it. But if you don't get that, that's still a pretty tight game. And when they broke the game open, really had nothing to do with Will Levis. So I look at the overall stats and go, look, I mean, 32 attempts, 303 yards, 3 touchdowns. Yeah, that's pretty good. And a lot of advanced stats, and Yar will look at it and say he was pretty good. EPA looks at it and says he's pretty good. QBR actually has him pretty low. They have him at 46, which means, and that's sort of situationally dependent. And so, I'll have to go back and look at the film and completely understand exactly what went on there. But this is a team that had 353 yards of offense against Miami of Ohio. Florida just put up 490 yards of offense against Utah. And so is Kentucky, like, this to me, the question is less about is less about the defenses, and specifically, can Kentucky keep up with Florida's offense? And that's one of the things I think is really interesting about the Utah game is Florida averaged 7.2 yards per attempt for the overall game, and that would have ranked 3rd in the country last year. So Florida just took a top 10 team, and from an offensive perspective was going racing up and down the field in terms of its efficiency numbers. Is Kentucky a better defense than Utah? With Pascal gone, I don't necessarily think so. And so is Levis going to be forced to try to keep up? And is he going to be able to? I think will be maybe the key question in the game.
I speaking of that Kentucky defense, they did have a nice outing against Miami of Ohio here. They did hold them under 300 yards, 3 sacks on the day. Very effective on third downs too, holding them to 3rd and 14 on third down conversions. And you mentioned the defense set up the offense with a short field to put distance on the scoreboard there in the second half. Key second half touchdown puts Kentucky up 27-10 in that one. Well, we kind of have the breakdown of Kentucky here. We have a nice little profile of them here. I'm kind of looking at it this way for Florida here on Saturday. The running game, you shouldn't have a problem with. Cavassier Smoke's good back. He's not going to light you up too bad. You can't give the free shots to Levis. As long as you shut down any free shots to Levis downfield and make him work underneath all night and make him earn everything, put together long drives, I think that's going to be the plan here with Levis. You got to shut down Robinson too. That's their main guy. Make those freshmen beat you. I don't care. Brown's explosive. Those couple guys, shut down Robinson, make the other guys prove it to you. And really offensively, you're going to keep leaning on the run game. One thing I would like to see this week, though, I'd like to see Richardson take a shot or two on the deep ball this week. We didn't see any super deep completions there from Richardson on Saturday, so I'd like to see a little bit of advancement in that category. And I think he'll get the opportunity here against this Kentucky team.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think last year Kentucky had a very concerted strategy against Emory Jones. They dared him to throw deep. And they said, look, we're going to take the thing that you do poorly, or at least the thing you do less well than other things, and we're going to try to make you do that. And so they're going to look at the film this week, and they're going to say, look, we're not going to let Anthony Richardson dump it off to that intermediate guy when they run play action and run the flood concepts to the right-hand side. Okay, that's fine. Now, they may also sit there and say, we're not going to have the defensive end crash. We're going to make him stay on the outside. We're going to try to pressure Richardson when he does run the play action there. We're not going to allow him to get the corner. Well, and so then it's going to be on Florida's offensive line to clear space, because then you got to be able to run the ball. And the reason that defensive end crashes is because you're able to run the ball. And that, I think, is, at least on the offensive side of the ball for Florida, is going to be the key. If Etienne and Johnson and Naquan Wright can put up 6, 7, 8 yards a rush, then you're going to have to crash. And if you have to crash, then Richardson's going to have the outside. If he has the outside, he's going to have his pick. And I think Florida's going to take a few deep shots, because I suspect that the plan for Kentucky is going to be similar to what it was last year. Now, it is interesting because when Anthony Richardson, they ran sort of a weird 3-3-5 last year with the linebackers spaced outside to prevent Emory Jones from being able to get outside on running plays. And then when Anthony Richardson came in the game, albeit in very limited fashion, they backed off that a little bit. And I wonder whether that was because they knew Richardson had the capability of taking those deep shots, and they didn't necessarily want to dare him to do that. I think, look, the daggers are going to be there. I think Richardson has the capability of hitting them. We'll see. I think the thing we see coming out of the Utah game, though, is he does have the ability to lead a quality, a quality step-by-step drive down the field without necessarily having things stall out all the time. But I think the one thing we're sort of looking for is maybe a little bit more explosion. You had the one big running play that he broke, but what else can he do? Are there other opportunities out there? I think they're going to take some shots. But I don't think they needed to take those shots against Utah. I think they were comfortable that they were going to be able to run the ball down the field. That's going to be the key, as it always is. I mean, the key is going to be, are they able to push Kentucky back with their running game? And then the same thing for Kentucky. And as much as we talk about Rodriguez, and now you got McLean, and then you've also got Ramon Jefferson, who look like they're both going to be out, right? So Jefferson, McLean, and Rodriguez may be out, which means Cavassier Smoke, and then who knows at the running back position. As much as we talk about that, the bigger thing I think that Kentucky fans should be worried about is they lost 2 offensive linemen to the NFL last year, one of whom was their left tackle. And so, look, I think Kentucky is worlds away from where Kentucky was as a program years ago. But the problem you run into is that it's still Kentucky. You don't have NFL quality linemen ready to step up year after year after year after year. You have to reload. And so when I look at the running performance against the Miami of Ohio, Is that because of the running backs, or is it because your offensive line wasn't clearing space? I think that's what we'll find out this week is if Kentucky gets bottled up. I don't think Levis, I mean, we saw last year against Florida, he was awful. Now, I think he's gotten better since then, but still, he's not good enough to carry a Kentucky team all by himself. And if truly Kentucky's offensive line has taken a step back, then I think Florida has a real opportunity to shut them down, especially considering the atmosphere in the swamp. And we opened this up by talking about the significance of the win over Utah. Well, one of the significances of the win over Utah is that place is going to be lit again, and it's going to be full and it's going to be loud, and everyone understands that opening up this season 2-0 with the way the season sat, essentially being 3-0 with USF. And then you got that road game at Kentucky. Like, you're setting up for something that could be Tennessee. Sorry. You're setting things up to be pretty significant heading into the meat of the schedule when LSU, Georgia, and A&M start showing up. And so, everybody's going to show up on Saturday lubed up and ready to go, just like they did last week. And had Rising been able to convert in the end zone, I'm not sure that would be the same thing. So, look, Levis is going to be coming into a hostile environment. If they can't run the ball, any quarterback, you put him in 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9 is going to struggle. I think Levis, even more so than others, has been able to rely on a running game that has put him in situations that allow him to succeed. And, we'll see. Kavasier Smoke has one of the best names, if not the best name in college football. We'll see whether he can convert his 7th year of eligibility into a big game against the Gators.
Hey, don't call Kentucky a basketball school. Mark Stoops will fight you, man. He almost fought John Calipari over the summer. He's going to fight you over it if you say, excuse the smirk there at the end. I was just thinking about LSU. That was that was a fun. That's all that needs to be said about it right there. No further comment. All right, everybody. 1-0 on the season. Big win over Utah to kick off the Billy Napier era. Plenty of aspects to improve still. And if the Gators make those improvements, you can definitely see this team do something special down the road here. But we'll take it one step at a time. The good one against Utah. Let's get Kentucky this week, and then we'll go back to the drawing board again. But great game out of Florida. Enjoy the game Saturday night in the swamp. I believe, what do we got? 7:00 kickoff, Will?
Absolutely. Gonna be fun.
Yep, 7:00 kickoff here in the swamp. Go Gators. Thank you for watching this episode of Stand Up and Holler. Be sure to subscribe to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel. Join our Patreon community at Read and Reaction for bonus content each week. And check out our website at readandreaction.com. I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles, and as always, go Gators.